Hello again, welcome to the video. Now in this video I'm going to be talking about camera sensor sizes and how they affect your images. A lot of people seem to overlook camera sensor size because they usually worry about lenses or camera features, so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, to kick things off, I'm going to talk about probably the most confusing aspect when it comes to sensor size is the crop factor. Full frame has a crop factor of 1, so it's essentially the base standard of photography. So if you take a 24mm lens, you will get a 24mm image essentially. Whereas let's say on a Nikon APS-C sensor, which is a crop sensor, that has a crop factor of 1.4. So if you take a 24mm lens on that kind of camera, you'll actually essentially be getting a 36mm image. Now something like, let's say a medium format actually has a crop factor of 0.5, so essentially it takes whatever focal length you're taking and actually making it wider. Now to go to more of an extreme level, Micro Four Thirds actually has a crop sensor of 2 times, which is actually quite simple to work out. It means you just have to take your focal length and multiply it by 2. So let's take the same 24mm, that turns into a 48mm focal length. Now the sizes of all these sensors can get quite confusing. I'm going to run you through a few of them right now. The size of full frame sensor is 864mm squared. The size of APS-C used by Nikon, Sony and Pentax is 370mm squared. APS-C on Canon, it's a tiny bit smaller, and it's 329mm squared. And something like a Micro Four Thirds system used by Olympus and Panasonic is 225mm squared. So you're probably wondering, okay, that's fine. Does it really matter what sensor size? Yes, it does to an extent, but technology is always changing. So let's say a crop sensor of today is probably going to be a lot different to, let's say, a crop sensor from a few years from now. Now, generally, larger sensors are usually able to have a larger resolution, usually because you've got more space to put pixels on. But this isn't usually the case because obviously Sony have released a tiny little phone sensor with a ridiculous amount of megapixels. So that's not always the case, but usually you can fit more megapixels on, which usually gives you finer detail and usually better freedom when it comes to, let's say, making massive prints. Now, another trait of larger sensors that usually they have better low light performance. Now, it's usually because the sensor is bigger, you can actually fit bigger pixels, which means they're actually more sensitive to light. But once again, this isn't always the case, as image processing technology might mean that smaller sensors in the future will be able to be just as good at low light photography than current full frame cameras. Now, the other trait of a larger camera sensor is that usually you get less background blur. Now, this is obviously dependent on the lens, focal length, and the aperture that you decide to use. But generally, larger sensors give you more background blur. That's why something like a phone that has a very, very, very tiny sensor hasn't got any background blur at all usually. Or it has to be added in after the fact in post-production, which never really looks like a real thing. Whereas something like a full frame camera or medium format camera, you can get a lot of background blur even when you're not using a very shallow depth of field. Now, what are the disadvantages to having a large sensor? Well, usually a larger sensor, you've got to have a larger camera. Now, a lot of let's say, crop sensors and full frame cameras usually can be about a similar size because there isn't a ridiculous difference. And usually manufacturers want to be able to use similar size cameras so it doesn't get confusing. But it's when you start getting to medium format cameras is they start to get turning into these massive cameras that you probably always have to use on a tripod. Now, what are the advantages of having a small sensor? Well, they're really compact. You can get them in a phone. And well, it doesn't distract me or anything, it doesn't make the phone bulky to carry with this sensor. Whereas let's say if you tried to put a crop sensor on something like it, it'd be massive, it'd be out to here, and it'd be ridiculous really. But that's really the main difference is for smaller sensors is that you can make smaller cameras, and that's useful for a lot of people. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video, me talking about camera sensor sizes and what's better and what's worse. But to be honest, it's not the be all and end all when it comes to cameras. I usually find that lenses and general camera features is usually a more important thing to consider when you're looking at a camera, but it is always something to consider of what size sensor you want to be looking at. So like the video if you disliked it, dislike if you disliked it, and I'll see you again in another video. Bye!